Okay, so it is July 9th,
9th, yeah.
and we're sitting here with Joe Brakes, Peter Hall, Andrea Walliser, and Elaine Brakes, and we're getting ready to talk with Joe about his experience working as a longshoreman for 502. So why don't you start maybe at the beginning and tell us how you came to be a longshoreman and how you got into working at 502.
Well, the reason I got into it, my dad was a longshoreman, so when I graduated from high school, I just kind of went down to the hall, and it was in June of '60. I tried to get a job, couldn't get a job. I kept going down there, and my dad and I were building a boat, so I'd work on the boat. And then in September, I got my first job. It was a night. It was in the afternoon shift, and it was a job setting the gear on a nitropryl ship. And there was one hatch working nitropryls, which is a fertilizer that was explosive. Mm. So they'd hired a gang and some spares, of which I was one, and we set all the gear for the next day. So that when the gangs came on the ship, they were ready to go to work. Mm-hmm. So that was my first job, and that was an afternoon shift. Okay.
And how come you weren't able to get on the previous year? Was there not enough work, or?
Yeah, it's just the way the dispatch system worked. It was kind of like a modified shape-up in a way. You would go down the hall and wait, and the dispatch, if there was jobs, you'd call out anybody want to work, and you'd just charge up to the wicket, and he'd pick you or pick whoever. So it just bad timing. It was fairly busy, but when I was there, there just was no work. So, so I didn't go every day, but I would go down once or twice a week. So until September, I got a job.
So is that how most guys would get in as
Yes.
longshoremen at the time? You just kind of wait and wait until they call you, and then if you get picked?
Yeah, everybody would go, if you wanted to work in the waterfront, you would go down to the hall, be there at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then you just wait. And the dispatcher would call out. The way it went, it was kind of funny. You would call out, is there any members want to work? And there was only about 3 guys that weren't in gangs. Everybody was in gangs in those days. Mm-hmm. And then there was a spare board, which was the highest level of casuals. Mm-hmm. And then he would say, is any spare board available? And again, most of those were in gangs too. There's only a couple of those. And then there was a preferred casual list of 15 people. And he'd say, is anybody in the preferred list? And there'd be nobody. Then he would go down to the cardmen.
Oh, okay.
And then he would say, anybody want to work? And if you hadn't been registered, you were in that anybody wanted to work group. So then you would just go up to the wicket and they would register you. And then you would get this little card. It's about the size of a credit card with your name and number on it. Mine was 2674C was my first number. And there was A, B, C, D, E, and F. And so that was you get this little card. And then the next day you could go in and they had a box. It was divided up alphabetically. There was 5 cards in the division, 5 cards in division. Mm-hmm. So then the dispatcher would call out your name and he would say, Andrea, and he'd call your name 3 times. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't answer, put you to the back of the box. Okay. So that's how the dispatch was done.
Wow.
Until once you got registered, and then you just moved your way up the rank. You became a spare board member, and then ultimately a member.
Okay. And were there any prerequisites for you to get onto the card system? None at all?
No. Just once you got registered, you got a card. Mm-hmm. Once you got a card, you're into the system.
You're in.
And you got registered by getting the first day's work.
Yeah. First day, yeah. Once the dispatcher picked you and registered you, you were in, and you got a number, and the way because everything then is done by the number. You get your check by the number, and you move up you get it on the seniority list by the number. Everything's done by your number, work number. That's true today as well.
And then what board do you go on to once you've got your number all set up? You've had your first day's work.
We were called cardmen. We were in that box, right? Mm-hmm. And then, just after I started, they disbanded that preferred casual list. There was only 15 guys on it. They were mostly members' sons. I never did get on it. They disbanded that, and then they just had what they called a spare board, which we would call today our A board.
Right.
And that was the only 2 boards there was. There was cardmen, a spare board, and then members.
Okay.
And so you just worked your way up. Once you got on the spare board, then you just worked your way up.
Okay. Sorry, you go ahead, Peter.
If you had once you moved from being a cardman to being spare, would you have been in the preferred casual pool because you were a son of?
No, I wouldn't. I probably would have got into it eventually, but like I say, they disbanded it about 2 months after I started.
Okay.
So they got rid of it. So then they only had the 2 categories: cardmen and spare board.
Thank you.
and members. And most of the Spareboard people in those days were in gangs, because the way it would work, if the side runner, who was a boss, or the hatch tender went down to the hall and said, send Joe back or send Andrea back, they would just send you back into the gang. So you could go work in a gang for a long time, just be dispatched with the gang until somebody got mad at you and said, we don't want you anymore, then you're gone. But because in those days they did all the dispatching, they had to handwrite the dispatch. So if they could fill up the gang with Spareboard, that was a lot easier for the dispatcher than handwriting all those slips. So what they would do is, if you're the gang, they would phone the hatch tender and say, give him the orders where the ship was, and he would phone the 2 winch drivers, and then the winch drivers and him would phone all the rest of the gang and give you your orders where you're going to work the next day. So that's how the dispatch was done. And then the spares or people who were absent, or any absence or holes in the gang would be filled out of the hall and dispatch day the next day. So that's how the dispatch went. And then when like in about the middle 60s, that's when the automation started, and so the gang sizes gradually reduced. Like I started out, there was 13-man gangs, and there was 8 men down below, 4 on each side, a hatch tender, 2 winch drivers, and 2 slingmen. And then like in middle 60s, the automation came on the ship, so they reduced the gang sizes down. And so then a lot of guys quit the gangs and went back on the boards. So then they had to come up with a dispatch system. So they tried all kinds of different systems. And we had these pegs, and they looked like, well, the casuals looked like a piece of chalk. They were white. And the members were clear, plastic. And they had the boards, and they were filled with holes, row upon row, about 8 rows of holes. So you'd run in the morning and you'd peg in, and number 1 would be number 1. And so they'd pull your peg out and they'd call your name 3 times. If you didn't answer, they'd put your peg. But what happened when people would go in and they would smack the board with their hand, and all the pins would shoot inside the hall. And then the dispatcher would pick this handful of pins up and hand them back outside. Well, then there was a riot trying to get your pin back in the hole again.
Because it's first come, first
First
serve.
serve, yeah. So I remember one morning there was this riot going on, and because I was a casual, so it didn't matter to me. I could care less. But the members they were almost a fist fight, and this guy crawled in on his hands and knees and crawled through this melee, reached up and pegged in number 1.
Oh my God.
And so that's
planting his flag.
Yeah. And the dispatcher could really tell funny stories, because he used to get there early in the morning, 5 o'clock, to open the hall. And one morning he looked out the door, and the lineup was down a block, down 10th Street, of members, not casuals, members waiting to get in to peg in. And as soon as he opened the door, the rush knocked him down, and he couldn't get out till the last guy was through.
Oh my God.
And when he got back in the office, the boards had been ripped off the wall. And there was pushing matches and going on all over the place. And it was really funny, because at 5 o'clock, or about 4:30, you couldn't drive down 10th Street, because guys would abandon the ship, roar down, stop in the middle of the street, get out of the car, run in and peg in, and come back out and try and go. So 10th Street, you couldn't drive down it from 4 to 5.
Longshoreman's rush hour.
Yeah, it was, yeah. And another funny story, a guy was running back to peg in, and he ran a guy down on Columbia Street.
Oh, no.
Didn't stop, ran down to the hall, pegged in, and went back to the accident.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. So the hall was at 10th and?
10th Street, yeah. 71 10th Street.
71 10th Street. Oh my goodness. How did well, first question is, tell us about the first gang that you got in. How did you get into that gang, and who were you working with in that gang?
It was Pastupa's gang, and the side runner asked for me. There was myself, Wes Budrug, Chris, I can't remember his name, and Ralph Thurian. Ralph Thurian went in and asked for the 3 of us. So we got sent back every day, and that was the winter of 61, and we were on fertilizer ships. We'd finish one ship, off that onto the next one. I think we worked fertilizer ships for 6 months, Just off one and onto the other, off one and another. Because a fertilizer ship, to fill it from empty to full, would take you probably 2 weeks. And so that would be 10, 12,000 ton of fertilizer. That's all would be on in fertilizer. The bags were 112 pounds.
Wow.
And so you just start in the bottom of the ship, and you'd come out 5 sacks high, and then you'd build a platform. And with it, we had dollies at that time, hand trucks, like big wagons. So we land the load and wheel them into the hatch. And so that's the first gang I was in. And I worked there in that gang for probably a year. And then I just quit. I got tired of doing that and went back to the Hall. Because the Hall, we get better jobs. One of my favorite jobs was timbers, 12 by 12 timbers. Because the ship's gear could only handle 3 ton. And those 4 timbers was a limit. So you come down 4 timbers at a time. And we'd have them stowed and sitting there waiting by the time the other side got their load. So we'd get probably a 10 or 15 minute break between loads. So they'd bring, because we were young guys and we could go at it, right? So they would bring the 4 timbers down. We'd stow them like nothing, and then we'd sit and wait for the next load. So timbers was a good job.
Was there, what was the leadership of each gang like? Was there a guy who was kind of the leader of each gang that would say, we want these 3 guys and that kind of thing?
The number one guy was the hatch tender.
Okay.
And the gang went by his name. Like if I was the hatch tender, it would be Breaks' gang.
Okay.
And then down below there was a side runner on each side, and they were like walking bosses. Some of them were tyrants. and then there was 3 other guys with them. If you measure the hatch divided down the middle by an imaginary line, we would call it shore side and offshore. Obviously the shore side's where the dock is, the offshore's offshore. And so those 4 guys would work together, and the side runner was the boss. And I mean, they were literally bosses. I mean, there was people that when they're coming, there'd be ladders would be down. You go to the open ladders in the hatch. They'd go out and see a guy coming down the ladder, and they'd holler for the foreman, and they'd say, "That guy goes or I go," because they didn't like that guy. So the foreman would say, "You're back to home."
And why wouldn't they have liked him?
Oh, who knows?
Any reason?
Any reason.
Personal reasons? Doesn't like the way he works? Or
guy did a bad job. Maybe smart alecked them or something.
Okay.
You didn't talk to them, right? I mean, you didn't. They were boss. So because if they went to the Hall and said, "I don't want Andrew in my gang ever again," you never went there.
Okay.
Because that's the way they were the boss. Some of them were, neat guys. I was teasing my wife. I call it siding. Because when you put the landing block down and then you put the load on it, it was their job to put the landing block where they wanted the load next time. Well, it's not rocket science. It's pretty obvious where it goes. But if you as a junior guy put the block there, they'd have to go and maybe move it just an inch. Or maybe even just touch it with the toe. Because that was their job. That was theirs. You didn't do that. And some of them, you didn't touch it. If you did, they would just holler at you.
Right.
Yeah. And most of them were really good longshoremen. Like some of them to work with them, it was a pleasure. Because they knew all the tricks of the trade, how to do stuff, how to move heavy stuff. They were good. Some of them were really good.
And were they all kind of open to taking on these younger guys and training you, or did any of them sort of guard their secrets at all?
No. But they're pretty rough, eh?
Yeah.
And for good reason, because there was the safety that was on there was what they did. So you learned the ropes, the safety rules, and what not to do and how to do it, where not to stand from them. Because if you were standing in the wrong spot, they would just scream at you and get out of it. Not in nice language either. And so you learned the ropes from them. Because there was no training. There was nothing. They would send you out to the job. The dispatcher would say, "You're going to whatever dock it was, number 1 ship and number gang." You go there. The foreman would say, "You're down on number 2 hatch." You go down below and find out what side you're on. And you just go to work. So there was nothing.
And then do you wait for someone to just say it's your first day and you're sent off? Do you just wait for someone to tell you what to do? Like, how do you start?
Well, you go down below, and you just, usually you'd end up with a partner, because if you're on lumber, that's what we did. You'd end up with a guy, and the guy would just say, "Here, grab the end, we can hit the dumb end."
Okay.
The new guys hit the long. I always thought, what a stupid thing. We would take the long lumber and go the furthest distance. And so they would say, take the long ones and hit the dumb end. And that's what you do. Because that's again, the side runner's job was to butt out. So if you can envision a hatch is a certain length, right? So you get a 40-foot plank and a 20-foot plank, and then you need a 10-foot to go in the fit on the end, right? So it was his job to do the butting out. So he would have to. So he'd want all the shorts for that. So you would take the longs and hit the dumb end, and then you'd put the middle length on, and then he would put the last one in. And the foreman would make sure they wanted to as close to the bulk as you could get. That was wasted space.
Right.
So they would like you to butt out with a foot or less of space between the last but the wall.
Wow.
And if you didn't do that, you get mad. The foreman would get mad at you for wasting space.
Were there bad foremen who longshoremen try to avoid?
Not really avoid them, but there were some guys. I guess they like to use their authority. But one thing about longshoremen, they didn't take any crap from anybody. They just tell them where to get lost. Because one of the beauties of the job is if they fired you, you were just fired for the day. And back then, if they fired a gang, if they fired somebody like you, because you got in an argument with a foreman, and they said you're fired, we'd all stand up and say we're all fired too, and we'd leave. And so they would pretty soon they'd hire you back because they couldn't. The ship would be down, right? That's before we got into arbitrators and labor laws and all kinds of things like that.
And so is there kind of a feeling of solidarity sometimes among the younger guys on the gangs? And
yeah, the gangs were like mini unions because you worked together all the time and you stuck together. So if a foreman was picking on somebody, he didn't only picked on for a very short time because then he had the whole gang on him. And we would just dog it, just take your time. And we worked to perfection. So the job would slow down. And then pretty soon the supercargo would come and say, what's the problem here? And then things would get smoothed over.
Okay. So can we just go over one more time, just describing the gang structure really slowly?
Okay.
And start with the foreman and the ship's representative.
Okay. Well, a ship would have. Well, it'd be, let's say a Liberty ship would have 5 hatches. There would be what we call a supercargo who was in charge of loading that ship. He was in charge of the loading, how it was loaded, what went in what hatch. And then when I started, there would be a head foreman and maybe 2 or 3 foremen under him who would be the hatch foreman. And then under that would be the gangs. Now the hatch tender would be the kind of the working boss. And he would, because oftentimes the foreman wouldn't be there, he'd be it. And then that gang was called whatever his name was. And then there'd be 2 winch drivers that would be running the winches that he would give signals to. There would be 2 people on the dock or the scow with slingmen. They would put the slings on the load so they could lift it down. And then down below there would be 8 men, 4 on each side of the ship. And out of that 4 would be 2 side runners who were the bosses, who were like working bosses, lead hands, I guess we call them today. Only they had more authority than a lead hand. And that's what would comprise the gang. And then on top of that, if it was a big ship or if it's like small lumber, we used to handle a lot of 1-inch. There'd be thousands of pieces in a load. So they would hire 4 spares, 2 guys each side for those kind of jobs. So then you would end up with 6 guys on each side. But the side runner was still in charge of all 6. And what he said went. So if he said we're going to load it this way, that's how you did it.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so we've gone through your first gang, and what kinds of jobs did you enjoy? Jerry was saying that he felt like you liked kind of switching things up and doing different things, and
yeah, but that's one of the beauties of the longshore industry is that you can, well, not so much back then, but now you can work a different job every day, different cargo every day. There it was similar. Like one of my favorite, like I said, it was timbers. Because we could hang what we called hanging the hook on the top side. We could get our job done and we'd wait and rest. Because that was kind of a thing that we used to call it hanging the hook. you'd like to get your job done so you could wait and it was their other side's load. Their
Okay.
turn to get a load, but your load's done. So you had to wait till they got their load, then you got yours. Then us young guys, we'd work like dogs. We'd get our load stowed and we'd watch. They'd be still working over on the other side. And we'd be sitting there in the shade resting. So that was called hanging the hook. Well, on timbers, you could hang the hook on the top side. Because they would just put a load on your side. Before the gear got back on the dock to get the next load, you'd have yours done.
Oh, okay.
So then it was the other side's turn. So
Right.
they'd get their load, then they'd have to go back out and get our load, bring it in. We'd get our load. By the time they hooked back out on the dock again, we'd have our 4 timbers stowed. So we'd be sitting there waiting. Because you don't go help the other side. You just do your side. So that's the way, so I like timbers. Another good job was metal, lead. We used to handle lead and zinc. Lead was in the 110-pound bars. And zinc was 60-pound bars. And because the bars are about maybe 20 inches long, 4 inches wide and 6 inches high, and they had a handle on either end. And so you could only work 2 guys at a time. So of the 4, you'd work 2 loads, you'd do 2, the other guys would rest. Then they would do 2 and you would rest. So again, if you got in a good position, you could hang hook on the top side again.
Okay.
So you could do your 2 loads, then you get 2 loads of rest, plus you had the hook on. So you get a rest, and that was a good job too. And it was clean. Lead was clean. And the zinc was really good because you got so we could throw them and they would slide into place. So you could just stand like from here to the Chesterfield and throw them and they'd all slide into place. So you didn't have to walk.
All kinds of ways of making things easier, aren't
Yeah,
there?
right, yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was nice because there was only 60 pounds, eh?
Yeah.
And they were only about that. They were about 1.5 inches thick, a foot long, 8 inches wide, and they were tapered. And they would slide. They were shiny, and again clean. So you could flip them, and they would just kind of slide into place.
What were the worst jobs?
The worst job for me was hides. What hides are is animal skins, cows, and they used to roll them into a bundle, hair side in, so we'd get the meat side out, and they'd cover them with salt, so they're all oozy with whatever, and they'd come down these, I don't know, maybe 100 these bundles again about 18 inches long, foot wide, 4 or 5 inches thick, tied with string into a package, and you'd have to stow those things. They'd come down. We'd have to, and we'd get plastic or whatever, get to cover ourselves, but we didn't have gloves or anything. It was
Oh,
a
my.
terrible job, smelly, greasy, terrible job. There'd be maggots on it and all kinds of stuff.
Oh God, that's funny. We were talking to a machinist last week, and he said that his least favorite job was going into the tannery because of the hides.
Yeah,
He said the tannery was just disgusting.
yeah, it
too.
was, yeah. So anyway, yeah, that was
Seems
the
like
worst.
everyone was familiar
Yeah.
with the hides.
And then the next worst one we get when we went to Vancouver, they always gave it was black cement. It was bags of cement, and it was black. And you would be black when you're finished. You'd be the color of your recording machine there. And it was a dusty, dirty. I hated that job. And the sacks were 80 pounds, and so they were heavy. So you had to carry them.
Oh my.
So that I
the
didn't like
worst
that
ones.
much.
Yeah.
And then the next worst one was probably we used to get 150-pound wheat bags of wheat, and one time in Vancouver they came down in nets, so you had to pick every bag up off the floor. And it was one guy, one bag. There was no helping the other guy. So
Right.
what we'd do there is we'd build this platform and land on top of the platform, so you didn't have to bend over. You could just drag them off. But until you got the platform built, you had to pick them up.
Yeah.
These were imported bags of wheat?
Exported.
Exported.
Yeah, we exported thousands upon thousands to the Russian. Remember the Russian wheat deal? And
Right, but that was so that you were taking them off trains?
they would do it at the elevator in Vancouver. They had these chutes, and they put the net out in front of the chute, and they shoot down whatever 10, 15 bags. The slingman would hook it onto the hook, and down to the hatch it would go.
Oh, and then you had to move them.
We had to stow it.
Oh, so they were being bagged up in that
Yeah.
elevator?
Yeah, and then there was 50 pounds, which were good.
Yeah.
They'd come in trays, and 50 pounds was nothing. We could just,
Yeah.
but the 150s were heavy.
Yes.
And then the heaviest thing we ever handled was coffee, and those bags ranged from 150 to 180 pounds.
Wow.
And they were sloppy bags. They're hard. Something that's stiff you can carry, right? But
Yeah.
something that's sloppy, like it's like carrying a body that's limp. It's really hard.
Yeah. So you had to be strong.
Yeah.
Too,
Well,
yeah.
we were young.
Yeah. So you worked with the same guys every day. Did you guys talk much throughout the day, or did you sort of stick to work talk, or?
It's basically just work. They didn't talk much, no.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit. They joke around and,
Mm-hmm.
tease the guys, but mostly you're working because you're, like if it was lumber, 3x9s, which were 3 inches thick and 9 inches wide, and they range from 8 feet to 40 foot. Well, if you're the young guys, you're taking the longest and hitting the dumb end, so you're on one end and the other guy's 40 feet away,
Right.
carrying it and taking it to the long end of the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you did.
So you came into your first gang with 3 other guys. Did you kind of come up together in the same pace?
Yeah,
and that
that's
kind of
it.
thing?
Yeah, it's kind of like a food moving down a snake. The bunch that you start with,
Yeah.
you work with that group all the time as casuals,
Yeah.
and then you move to the next level and you work again. And so when you get in membership, you kind of go in as, not as a group, but as a, because we were taking them in 5 at a time
Mm-hmm.
5 guys. So that whole group would get in, say in 1 or 2 years, that whole group would be in. So you kind of worked up the ranks together, yeah. So similar today, the guys that all retired, but we all basically started around the same time and worked our way through.
Kind of like classes.
Yeah,
coming
kind of,
in
sort of,
and
yeah,
Retiring
yeah,
together. Yeah.
So when did tell us about how the what became of the gang system?
Well, like I say, again, in the early 60s, middle 60s, when the automation started, package lumber started. I mean, I told you about the Assassinator. And then when I started, there was no machines on the ships at all, none. Maybe a hand truck or a dolly, but that was it. Everything was carried or pushed or whatever. Then they got lift trucks that we could get on the ship, and what they had to do was take the counterweight off, because the gear again was only 3 tons. And the lift trucks were heavier than that, so they'd split them in half. So the lift trucks come on to the ship because we got packaged lumber, and then the gangs, the winches, the ships started using electric winches and cranes, because before when I started there were steam winches. There was 2, one on each side, so it required 2 drivers. But when the electrics came in, we got a lot of doubles, so one guy could run both winches or cranes, one guy. So then they got rid of one, negotiated away one winch driver. And the gang sizes gradually went down from 13 to 8 men to now there's no gang sizes basically. Because like when it was package lumber, you'd have 4 guys down below instead of 8 and 1 lift truck driver. And that's the interesting thing, like down below when I started, the hard work was down below. The easy jobs are topside, what we call topside. And one of the easiest was slingman. Because the slingman, especially if it was 1 inch lumber, they'd wrap these huge loads up. And then they could sit down for half an hour. Go out, well, we stowed them, right? They'd put one down one side, one on the other, and land one on deck, and then they'd wait. And then do that again, and then they'd wait. But when automation started, the work switched from down below down to the slingman. And now the slingman is a terrible job.
Oh, wow.
Because you're just going steady, because you're continually hooking up stuff.
Because it's moving so quickly.
Everything, yeah, machines are just going. Because I remember one time when it was 93 when I was laid off from West Shore, I was driving gantry, and they'd make loads up. They were 40 feet long, 2 packages high and 8 feet wide, and I'd lift that whole thing. And those poor slingmen, they wouldn't even get to sit down, because I would stow the load, I'd come back out, and I'd pick up the next one, and then they just all day they just hooked up. They never got to stop. And the guy down below was just standing there waiting. Case one, because they had automatic unhookers, I'd hit a button on the floor and they'd all unhook. Well, sometimes one wouldn't, so a guy'd have to be there to unhook it.
Okay.
So as long as everything worked, he was just sitting there. So down below it became a really cushy job.
Oh,
The
wow.
slingman turned into a garbage job.
Okay.
Was there a resistance to the demise of the gang system?
Yes, it was a struggle. It took several years, several negotiations, lots of slowdowns, and lots of trouble, yes.
Just
It
because
wasn't-
less work for fewer men?
Well, it was changed mostly because if you look back on it, the work actually increased. It just changed.
The volume and that
Yeah,
kind of thing
yeah.
increasing? Oh, okay.
And the work went from hand handling everything to basically hand handling very little. It's done by machines now.
Right.
And now today it's containerization, right?
Okay. Were there many skirmishes over that between you guys and the employer? Or
Oh
was
yeah,
it
many. Yeah, we would have slowdowns. When they tried to get rid of the one winch driver, we had a slowdown for a month. It was terrible. It was a contest between which gang who would do the least, but you couldn't stop because if you stopped, they'd fire you. So you had to keep moving. So you'd carry the same board back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Yeah, it was terrible, but that's what we did. Yeah.
There's an art to a slowdown then.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, you can't stop because they'd be waiting to see if anybody stopped. Just stood there, they would fire you, right? And fire the whole gang. It's not just you, the whole gang. So I remember when we went to Vancouver and in a slowdown. Can't remember what the issue was now, but anyway, it was Christmas time, Japanese oranges. So it was a foreman strike, yeah, because they had all these office workers out there. So when it was oranges, we would rig tents because it was raining, wintertime, Christmas time, because you couldn't get the oranges wet. So we'd rig these tents. So this young guy came out from the office someplace, and there was a big hullabaloo, which gang went to which hatch, and finally he got that sorted out. So he said, you have to rig tents. So we had fine. So we rigged tents. Took us till about 2 o'clock to rig the tents. But instead of rigging the tents for the dock, we rigged them all for the water. So when he found out that, he said he fired the whole ship. The whole ship was fired. We're all gone. And then we had to get back as Vancouver, because if they fired you, they would provide transportation to and from.
Okay.
But if they fired you, you had to get on your own. So we all had to get our own taxis back.
But the point was made.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
You said that when you had a slowdown, you had competitions between gangs.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's good competition, and there's probably bad competition. So, talk about how did the gangs compete with each other in good and bad ways?
Yes. Well, what would happen there, and there was one foreman, I can't think of his name, but he would go and say, the gang in number 5 hatch is doing 5,000 an hour. What's wrong with you guys? And you'd find out after that wasn't true. And they tried that a little, but that didn't work. Because what would happen is somebody would go up there and say, what's with you clowns? And then find out, well, we're not doing any better. And then you'd go back. And then that would have the reverse effect. We'd say, well, okay, you want to play games, we'll show you how to play games, right? And then we would just slow down. Another trick they would do is if the foreman would come down and say, I'll relieve you, go sit and have a rest. And he would try and run fast. We used to call them one-load wonders because they would run like crazy for one load. And then they were wore out. Well, we had to do it all day, not just for one load. So they tried that to speed things up. There's all kinds of those kind of games played, but they didn't work out very well. Again, because the gang system, again, was still fairly well intact, and everybody kind of stuck together. And you caught on to those kind of tricks.
Did you guys socialize together as gangs, like after the workday was over?
Some did, yeah. Some did. You'd go and have some guys would go and have a beer after. And we had a 1 hour lunch, so guys would head up to the pub for 1 hour.
Oh yeah.
Have their dollars worth of courage, they used to call it. And then so they socialized that way. And then some people did socialize after, friends. They'd go out for dinner and stuff like that, yeah.
When you started, I believe that 502 was pretty small compared to Vancouver, and,
yes.
and you've talked about traveling up to Vancouver. Can you tell us about when did you have to go up to Vancouver? And what was that like?
Well, Vancouver would be really busy, and so they would need extra gangs. So they'd phone over and say, we need whatever, and then they would dispatch us to ships. They would tell the hall, we need gangs here, wherever they wanted them. And then the hall would dispatch us to Vancouver. And the Vancouver dispatch, the dispatch to Vancouver was quarter to 7 in the morning, not 7. So then, at first there was no transportation, so we'd have to drive over. But then guys would get lost and all kinds of funny things would happen. So they'd get to the ship at different times. So then the company decided, well, it's better if they'd hired transport, which it was, because they would have a bus. Everybody get on the bus at Westminster, and we'd all arrive at the same time. So that's how that would happen. And then we had what they call traveling cards between the locals. You could get a traveling card. When it was slack in Westminster for a long period of time, a bunch of us would get a traveling card and go over to Westminster, or to Vancouver, sorry. And with the traveling card, they'd put you on the board, Vancouver board, and you could work temporary. They put in eventually rules 30 days. Started with 60 and then they reduced it to 30. Mm-hmm. So for 30 days you could work out of Vancouver almost like a Vancouver member. Mm-hmm. And the same would happen with us too.
And is that what was referred to as wolfing? Like if you
No,
what
that was
wolfing?
a traveling card.
Okay, travel card is different than wolfing.
Yeah, wolfing came in much later. What wolfing was, and as the industry progressed or got modern, the docks started hiring large regular workforces. You worked at the dock. That's your job. You went there every day. You didn't go to the hall. But on the weekend, when there was no work, the hall would be busy. So you could go down to the hall and what they call wolfing.
Okay.
So you go to the dispatcher and say, I'm wolfing. He would take because anybody on a regular workforce, they had them on a special board. Mm-hmm. And they'd take your plate and put it on the desk and make a pile. Put you in order. And then when all the members and everybody had gone to work, then they'd call you out, say, Andrew, do you want to go on whatever? And you say, yeah. They'd write you, or stamp your name on that thing.
Okay.
And it came about because one of the guys called it keeping the wolf away from the door, because it was hungry, right? Uh-huh. So they named it wolfing. Okay. And it goes on today now, because there's people that work at West Shore steady. That's the only. So on their days off, they can go down to the hall, and you're the last member out. You're when all the members are gone, then you go. You're the next guy ahead of the casuals.
Okay.
You're the last member out.
Okay.
And then same with the Fraser Surrey. Any of the regular, what we call regular workforce jobs, where people go to those jobs every day. That's their job. Can wolf on their days off.
Okay.
So how do the this is a slightly side question, but the regular jobs at West Shore at the moment, how many days are those guys working out at West Shore? And is it year on year kind of system?
Yes, yeah. Once you go there, they post for regular jobs. They have what they call white lists, which are spare men as well. But a regular job, they post it, and you're hired in the gang. And they have 5 gangs of 10 guys, and you work a 6 and 3 schedule. It's really a good schedule. Mm-hmm. You work 6 days, 3 off, 6 days, 3 off, 6 days, 4 off, and then you repeat that. Mm-hmm. And it's a 24-hour operation, so you work all 3 shifts, every week a different shift, unless you get a day job. Like when I was there, I had a steady day job. I didn't work graveyards. I worked days and afternoons. But if you're in the gang, as what we call an operator, which just running the equipment, you work all 3 shifts. Mm-hmm. And it takes, it's kind of like a preferred position. It takes you a fair number of years to get there. I don't know what it is now. You had to have about 25 years of seniority to get there.
Is that because it's steady work and you can depend on going in certain times every day?
And it's a good schedule. You get a lot of time off. Mm-hmm. And you get, when you got seniority like that, you get 7 weeks holidays.
Oh, wow.
And the salary continuance plan is quite good. The LT plan is quite good. And the pension is better.
Mm-hmm. And if you've got a family, I imagine it's good because you can come home at the same time every day.
Every day, you're home. And and you know your schedule, right? Mm-hmm. You know which weeks you're going to work afternoons and which work. And what most people do is they'll take a week's vacation on a graveyard. And then if you work overtime or your stats, you can bank them. Mm-hmm. So you can build up. Well, that's what I did. I wouldn't take pay from my stats. I would bank it. Mm. So I'd get paid double time, so I'd bank 2 days. So when I retired, I had a year in the bank. So the last year I could take off.
Wow.
And full pay.
Wow, yeah.
And so that's another good feature. So once you get there for a while, you can build up a bank. So you don't work your graveyards. People can bank either holidays or bank off your graveyards. Yeah. And then they're replaced by people out of what we call the white list out of the hall. They're temps. Mm. And I don't remember how many guys. I think there's 120. I might be wrong on that. 120 guys on the wait list. And so they go out and replace people like me who took their time off. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And those positions are for a year and then they're advertised at the hall and
Nope, they're for, if you're steady, you're there for till you quit or get
Oh,
fired.
okay, okay. So
Like-
it's not like a steady position out of
No,
500.
no, 500 is the only guys that have that rule. You're the way they repost every year.
Yeah.
We don't have that yet. And West Shore is a permanent position. Because we couldn't really do that, because when a guy comes back, when he's out at West Shore, this is one of the anomalies, I can explain that later, but when you come back, if you quit West Shore and you come back, you basically start BCMA as a new employee. Like you've broken your holiday service. You have to earn 500 hours a year to keep your BCMA holiday. But if you don't work 500 one year, you lose everything. So if you're working at West Shore and you don't wolf a lot, and you come back to the hall, you start basically at zero for holidays. So it's and the reason for that is when we got West Shore in 1968-69, Kaiser Resources, they developed it, and old Kaiser didn't believe in joining employers associations. He refused to join employers associations, so he wasn't going to join the BCMA. So what he told Harry Bridges, which was our international president, he said, if you're going to force me into the BCMA, I'll sign with the operating engineers. But if you will give me a separate contract, then you can basically, I'll make sure that nobody ever suffers, but I'm not joining the BCMA. So 502 had to make a decision. I was on the executive at that time. So we had to make a decision whether we did that or not, because the BCMA was going to go ballistic when we did that. So we made the decision to do it. So then we opened negotiations with them and signed a separate collective agreement. The net result of that was that the BCMA forced us to sign an agreement that we wouldn't sign any agreement that was less than the BCMA.
Okay.
Because we couldn't go for work for less hour anything. And Strang, who was the president of the BCMA, sent a letter out in October saying that anybody, because a lot of our guys had gone down and worked there already, he gave them 30 days to get back. And if they weren't back under the BCMA umbrella in 30 days, he deregistered the whole lot of them. So a whole bunch of guys did, because they didn't realize, we didn't know how long West Shore was going to last, whether this was a 10-year thing or, it's turned out to be better, but we didn't know at the time. So a bunch of senior guys who'd gone down there quit and come back. So then we filled it with junior guys. And some guys were senior and they decided we were going to take a chance. So they went down there. So then the task is to buy up all their service at West Shore. So every negotiations we would have a demand in to buy up. First thing we got them to buy up was their holiday pay. So a guy that went down there with 20 years of BCMA service got 20 years of West Shore, even though he hadn't worked for them for 20 years. They bought it up. And then the next thing was a salary continuance, because when you went down to the credit with 2 years, we said, no, you got guys down here that worked on the waterfront for 20 years. They would buy this, so they agreed to buy that up. Because the guy with 20 years of service gets 6 months of full salary pay before he goes in LTD. And then the last one was the pension. We got them to buy up the pension time. So, and all through that, we had to make sure that every negotiations, the West Shore contract was a higher cost than the BCMA, which we always did. So that's how that happened.
Couple of things. Is that agreement between West Shore and 502 that it's going to be more expensive than the BCMA? Is that still in place?
No, that we got rid of that language.
Okay.
And so, like, as what the language basically said, if we signed a lesser agreement, then we had to offer that lesser agreement to the BCMA. Well, that's all gone now. Yeah, we got rid of that when we got rid of the guarantee, and all of that stuff went. So now,
When was that?
that would be in 75, 76, somewhere in there. And so now they're two parallel things. They still creates friction, because BCMA once in a while says that West Shore is stealing all my good tradesmen, which I don't think that happens, but that's what they claim. And there's always a bit of friction between the two, but not like it was before.
Next question is, what was Harry Bridges' position on this issue?
His position was that we take it, because I spoke to him many times on this thing. When I was president, I would talk to him about it. He said, no, you guys did okay. And then now looking back, some, 30 odd years, we did do okay. It was not a bad decision.
And what was the root of the objection to being part of the BCMA?
I'm not sure what his objection was. He didn't belong to the PMA down south. And any time he worked on the water, as he had waterfront type work, he would contract it out to one of the PMA members. He just had a thing that he did not believe in belonging to employers associations. So he didn't join any. Kaiser was independent.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get to be, so you said that you were on the executive by, 1968, or?
Yeah, well, I was sworn in the union in April of 65.
Okay.
And you can't run for office until you've been a union member 1 full year
Okay.
in good standing. So I couldn't run for anything that year.
Mm-hmm.
I got onto the safety committee, and so the next November, our elections are always in November, I ran on for the executive.
Okay.
And that's an interesting one because my dad was on the executive for years, and his initials are JF Brakes.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is JT Brakes, but when they make up the ballots, they put them out in alphabetical order, and the secretary, knowing my dad, put JF Brakes.
Mm-hmm.
So I am almost certain I won the election because some of the old guys who didn't know me thought they were voting for my dad.
Oh my gosh. Oh my.
But anyway, I won. So I was on the executive from then. And then in 69, I was only going to run 2 years, but I stayed the third year because that was negotiations year. And that was an interesting year because 69 was a year that we almost lost the whole caboodle. Because we went, that's the year that we developed a West Shore style collective agreement for BCMA. One rate for all shifts, guarantee, and a whole pile of goodies. I mean, the wish list would have sunk to Queen Mary. But anyway, so we went into bargaining and went on strike around the middle of July. And we were out strike for about 40 days. And the union started to fall apart. We had all kinds of people meeting in basements and all kinds of bad things going on. So then the area board decided to go back to work for 90 days. So we went back to work, and in that 90 days we had a convention and fired all the officers, and they elected a new bunch.
Wow.
Including you.
No, I was never on the area. I was on the
you
I was on the strike committee and on the executive.
Okay.
And and then we had a caucus after that, and we developed a new package. Actually, I think bigger than the first package. And then went back into bargaining. And I remember Bobby Gerardo, I don't know if you've met him, he's the guy I'd like to get into this because he knows a lot of stuff. Christmas Eve, him and I were out buying Christmas presents for our wives at a break from the caucus because we had to finish it up. So we finished it that night, and we went in the new year into bargaining, and we had new officers, we fired everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And the president, Bobby Peebles, was the president of the Canadian area then, went in and he handed the demand across the table to Strang, who was the spokesman for the company. And I think he must have had it set up because he had a garbage can. He never even looked at it. He just threw it in the garbage. Because he knew he had us whipped. Eh? We turned down 2 or 3 contracts each time the vote got less and less. Because he knew we were starting to fall apart and all kinds of things were going on. Meetings in people's basements and people wanted to go back to work. And it was... And the area officer, the international officers, Lou Goldblatt was your Secretary of Treasurer. He wrote the Canadian Union off. He said they're finished, they're done.
Wow.
But Harry Bridges says no, they'll come through. He stuck with us, and so we did. We ended up. Eventually, it was Maxey, Bryce Maxey. He was the Labour Minister. Came out here, and he had everybody down at the Vancouver Hotel Company Union. Everybody, basically threatened both sides with some nasty stuff if we didn't settle. So we settled, and in February we voted on that contract, passed it. If you put them all together, that was the worst of the bunch. But we were weak. So we come close to losing the whole thing. Mm-hmm. People were kicking in the doors of the area and all kinds of stuff. Some people from your guys up down there too.
From SFU?
SFU down there.
Yeah, you told me that.
Yeah, some of our members now who don't want to admit to it were involved in it. You know, it was a bad time, just a bad time.
So was the perception that the union was all on the ropes, was that just because there was dissent among the membership around this particular strike?
And we couldn't agree on anything. And we couldn't agree whether it was daytime or dark. Eh?
And the employer knew that.
Yeah, they knew that. Yeah, and they've got people that tell them what everything. Eh? I mean, when you pass something, they know almost instantly.
How do they know that?
They have people that tell them. I can remember one time when I was at a caucus, and we just got our booklets of all the demands, and I had to go down to see Kahan at the BCMA about some problem. And I walked in, there was our booklet on his desk. How did he get it so quick?
And would that have been like a member or something that would have passed
I don't know, Andrew. I have no idea. But I mean, I had the book myself, maybe 2 hours, say. And he had it when I got.
Wow.
So how do you do that?
Yeah.
So that's you just live with that.
Right. And so what was the dissent like, or what was it like to, I guess, be on strike and have all that dissent going on among the membership? Like, were there kind of little cliques that formed that were all in agreement about one thing? Like, we should go back to work? Or
yeah, that's what it was. There was groups that would say, should have to go back to work, or let's get rid of these guys, or all kinds of plans. There was no... And then on top of that, we had to go to the banks and to car loan people, because people are going to lose their houses and cars, because we'd been on strike for a long time. Mm-hmm. We'd have to go to the bank and say, look, can you... And we lent money out to people, and just to keep...
We being the strike committee.
Yeah, the different locals did different things. Mm-hmm. We had a food bank. Guys are going up the valley to the farms and getting food. The hall was like a food bank. And we had money we'd lend out, and we would go up to the banks and car loan all over, because people were in bad shape. Eh?
Wow. So being on strike is really a gamble for...
Oh, it's a big gamble. It's
for
not
the
a fun
members
thing.
that are... And you're paying for that almost in terms of...
Yeah, well, striking it's a difficult thing. It's easy to get on strike. Very, very difficult to get off.
Stay on strike, and
Very difficult. Mm-hmm. And like, once you've done it, what do you do next? It's like if a big guy comes at you and you punch him and he doesn't stop, what do you do next? You run? Mm-hmm. It's like once you strike, what do you do next? You fired your big gun, right? Mm-hmm. So then it becomes the war of duration. Mm-hmm. Who can outlast who? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And nowadays the duration is short because the government intervenes almost instantly.
Right.
That 1969 negotiation and then strike. Why do you think the union was pushing so hard for a big deal, and why do you think the employers kicked back so hard?
Well, there'd been some discussion with the area officers prior to, and with the BCMA, and I think one of the reasons was that the membership as a whole didn't know a whole lot about it, kind of kept out of it. I mean, we knew it was going on, but didn't know the details. And the other thing was, it was a huge, huge change compared to what we had been doing. I mean, it was like we had, our shifts were daytime was straight time, afternoon was time and a half, and graveyard was double time. So we were switching from that to one rate for all 3 shifts. Mm-hmm. And the shifting was 8 hours daytime, 7.5 night, 6 hours graveyard. We were going to go 8 all the way through. Every shift 8, because that's how West Shore is. Every shift is 8 hours.
At the same rate of pay.
And all the same rate of pay. So, but what West Shore does is we basically took the afternoon rate and added a little bumper to it and made that the rate for all 3 shifts. So that was the concept that they were going to put onto the BCMA. And it was just too much for the ordinary rank and file to... I mean, those kind of things you got to ease into.
Yeah. So
when what happened was they got pretty close to it. I think the rate was $51. I remember that rate. That was going to be the rate, $51 a shift. It was pretty good money in those days.
Yeah, sure.
They got to about 46, 47, I think, dollars. When they came back to the negotiating committee, which was the area board in those days, the vote split, 9-9. And Henry Kotowicz was the president. He broke the tie. So when it came back to the membership, the negotiating committee was split, almost 50-50. The tie was broken by the president. So when we went to the membership meetings to explain to it, it turned into it was a zoo. I mean, it was funny, and not funny, but guys were lighting them on fire and waving them and burning them.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and it was, and then that was, and then it went downhill from there. So it was poorly handled. I mean, that wasn't the way to do those kinds of changes.
And polarizing even among the negotiators.
Oh yeah, the negotiating committee itself was violently split.
And so because the president was the tiebreaker, was there a sense that the executive had kind of made this decision against perhaps?
I guess there was. And then that, like when the decision was to fire them all, he was fired, Andy Kotovich. He was gone.
How much of this was, because you said it was the area committee that met with the
it was the area
employer.
board, yeah.
It was the area board. So how much of this was different locals having a different perspective on the issue?
Yeah, well, there was some of that too, but the board is made up from representatives from the locals.
Yeah.
We had 2 at the time. 500 had, I'm going to say 5 or 6, and then each of the other locals had 1 because they're smaller.
Right.
And then there was the 5 area officers. There's the president, first vice, second, third vice, and the secretary treasurer. And those 5 would actually go in and meet with the employers on most issues. Once in a while the whole board would be there, but most of the time it was just the 5. And then they would report back to the board.
Right.
So when they came back with the contract, and it was all over then.
Okay.
Wow.
And then when they went to the caucus, because then that whole reports to the caucus, and the damage was done. I mean, because everybody went out and reported, how bad it was and what terrible things had gone on. So when we went to the caucus, everybody was ready for war, right? And then it just spread through the membership. Because you remember, we'd already turned down 2 or 3 contracts, so they weren't happy.
Mm-hmm.
So how did the membership, or how did you guys try to come back from that really polarizing split among your
Well,
membership?
it was with a long, long time and with much difficulty. And some would say the government helped, because what happened in 1972 was the first time we were ordered back to work. And Nathan Nemetz was appointed as the guy to settle the contract. So again, it was the same kind of story. Went in with our usual wish list of 300 or 400 demands. Strang was there, and said, you're all crazy. So we went back and forth. Finally went on strike. This time they passed the Ports Operations Act, ordering us back to work. I think we were out 7 or 8 days.
Yeah.
So they passed the act and appointed Nathan Nemetz, and he met with both the parties. We met at the UBC at the president's residence in the basement. That's where he conducted the things. And Matkin, Matkin, he was his assistant. He's a lawyer, labor lawyer. So they met with both parties and heard us out, and then he wrote the contract. And our issue at that time, 502, is they were wanting to contract out Fraser Surrey Dock, or portions of it. So we were death against that. And I spoke to Nemetz about that, and he put it in there that there'd be no contracting out of land areas, right?
Right.
Because we'd done a similar thing at 1A PCT. When cars came, cars are a different animal. It's what I call a place of rest argument. Usually a place of rest is a point in the dock or on a car or on a truck. But an automobile, because it's mobile, place of rest can be anywhere. So Brown said to the union, he looked out his window and he said, the place of rest for that car is right there, because I decided it's right there. So he parked the car there, and that's not my car anymore. It's yours. You own the car. You come and get it. So it became an issue with where cars, and so the union did. Don Garcia and those guys, they took what 1A was the lumber dock, and they made that a designated area, and that's all the cars would go there. And then us guys, being the kind of guys we were, we thought, well, we'll stop at the gate, because we used to go in this fenced area and park them. And then when we were done, the Teamsters would come and get them out of there and drive them off or load them on trucks. So we thought, well, why would we do this? We'll stop at the gate, and the Teamsters can take them and park them. The ship finishes early. We get to go home full pay. Well, it turned out the dumbest thing we ever did, because now we just gave up our jurisdiction. So we ended up in court over that. It was one of my first acts as president. Ended up in court, sued, and all kinds of things bad happened. So anyway, So then the negotiations were just going on. My issue was that we don't end up contracting out land like that ever again. So that was put in the contract.
So when was that? When was that car issue?
That was being 72 because that was my first year as president.
So you gave up the jurisdiction in 72, and then
we gave it up actually earlier in 71.
71.
Yeah.
And then in 72 you
Yeah.
went back to a kind of an area.
And then PCT was gradually phased out into it. So the problem actually went away.
Yeah.
And then Fraser Surrey decided that they were going to do the similar kind of thing, only with lumber. They were going to use the American system where the trucks come in, the truck driver unloads his truck, loads lumber, and then when it goes to ship, we take it from there. So we had an argument with that. We used that language to stop that. Because that was the goal. That was what they wanted to do.
And you used the same language for Annacis as well.
Yeah. Well, Annacis was another one of our kind of failings because that's a similar system there where we unload the ship, take the cars to an area and park them, and then we leave them. When the ship's done, we go, and then the Teamsters take them and load the rail, load them on trucks, do whatever. It's one of our failings. We try to get, but see what happens is that they sign with the Teamsters. Once they sign, you're done, right? Mm-hmm. So they sign with the Teamsters to do all that kind of work. So that's kind of the way that we split that jurisdiction up.
Mm-hmm. What are you? We talked about not getting the constant rate.
Yeah.
So those are some failures. Let's talk about some successes.
Well, one of the successes that turned out to be, and it's funny how sometimes things that are looked to be a failure turn out to be not good, is our container clause. Mm-hmm. The container clause was one of the things that happened in '69, and that was because there was, I think, a split in the BCMA. The dock operators wanted the container clause. The shippers weren't so keen on it, because what the container clause said was any container with two consignees in it was stripped or stuffed on the dock by us, by the dock. So the dock got the work and the money. Unless it was going outside the 50-mile radius, then it could go free. Any container with one consignee in it could go free. Mm-hmm. So that resulted in a lot of work. And now when the container clause was taken away, we thought we were going to lose. But what we got, and it was again one of those legislated settlements again, we got the rate, $10 for every 20-foot container, $20 per 40-foot container. Mm-hmm. And it turned out, because the containers went nuts, right? We're now doing containers almost totally. We're getting a lot of money. And we had a decision to make in the union, what we do with that money. Mm-hmm. So at the time, there was only basically two locals that handled containers, us and Vancouver. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't fair that we would get the money, because every local said we. So there was a big debate at a convention, and the decision was that we would put it into the pension, mm-hmm. which turned out to be one of the wisest things we ever did. Because now there's millions of dollars going into the pension plan every year.
And you keep your membership happy that way, because it's all going into the pot for all the members?
If it had been, like some guys said, let's just write every member a check every year, whatever, divvy it up by, divide the number of membership into money, and you get a check for, we'd have just spent it on whatever, we would have had nothing. Eh? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now we've got this pension that's very secure, so as containerization goes. And so now we're getting containers from Rupert, us, the island. Everybody's into the container business in a way now, big or small, and that's probably the way of the future. Mm-hmm. So as long as that carries on, and it's a legislated settlement, so when the employers want to get rid of it, we just say, no, that was driven down our throats. We got to live with that. You like that one? You liked it at the time, so live with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what, it seems like you wanted to be on the executive or be involved in the union from the very first, from
I did.
early in your
I did, yeah.
Why was that?
I don't know, I was just interested in it. Mm-hmm. Well, that was one of the questions they asked you when you were interviewed. Would you be prepared to serve? And I said, yeah, I would. I wouldn't mind.
Oh, okay.
So you had to wait the year, right? So I did. And then you went on from, you get more and more involved. You have to make a decision, though, because it can take over your life,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes, that's all you do. So you end up becoming a union widow sort of a thing. You lose your family, everything goes, because that's all you're doing. Because it's one of those things that it fills the time allotted to it. So if it's 24 hours a day, you can go 24 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
Especially nowadays when the industry goes 24 hours a day.
Right.
Do you see people burning out?
Yes. Yeah, people do.
Can you share some stories about that?
Well, they don't, I guess typical males, they don't say anything. They just kind of fade off, right? They don't do anything bad or anything. You can see them just kind of wearing down. And then usually they don't run or they get defeated. Because they end up not doing the job. Not answering the phone calls or not coming out to the job or whatever the thing is. So people get really, we tend to eat our young. And we have elections every year, so you're in for 1 year, right? Which is kind of not a good thing in a way nowadays, because in 1 year you hardly know who's on the other end of the telephone when you phone, right?
Right.
Never mind know what to do.
Right.
So you just nicely catch it on, and then you're gone.
There's a
right?
lot of job not a lot of time to get to know the
that's
job.
right.
And
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
there's a lot to it now.
So what was your first job for the executive, and what kinds of jobs did you moved up eventually to president?
Yeah, well, first I was on the executive, and I did that for 3 years, and then I was convention delegates, and then in '69 I was on the strike committee, and then I was on the executive, which was interesting because I got to be in some of the meetings that to do with the strike.
Yeah.
So that part was and then I took a year off, and then I ran for vice president. I got beaten because, well, when we amalgamated this, I'm going back now again. When we amalgamated the dock and the deep sea, the 502 and 511. The 511 was the dock local. That wasn't such a nice thing either. There was some hard feelings around that. And it happened in '63, '64. And when I got on the executive in '66, it hadn't totally been completed, because one of the understanding was that the locals would amalgamate. 511 would have guaranteed 3 spots on the executive for 3 years, and in that 3 years, either local could take a vote, 50% plus one, and get out of the amalgamation. So when we would be debating something, these 3 guys from the dock may not agree with us. So one guy, I told him to get lost. I forget. So he threatened to punch me out. So we ended up in a big argument. So they were going to take their vote. And get out. He said,
take off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we basically said, well, go ahead, do it. Gone. Because we'd got the dock, and so all they would have had was PCT. I always said to that guy, just think about if you'd have done it, you'd have been a bellhop down there at one of the hotels, because PCT disappeared, right? But anyway, but the cooler heads prevailed, and so we didn't. So when I ran for vice president, they had 80 members, and that's a block, voted against me because they didn't like me. So if you had a block of 80 votes, you could basically win. Right? So I lost that election. So then the next year, the guy ran for president and won again, but I ran for vice president. And so he, talk about burnout, the poor guy collapsed, eh? So he resigned, so I ended up being president.
Okay.
In February of '72. I ended up being president because he quit.
A presidential succession.
Yes, and so that started it. And then, I think it was in the March meeting, I was chairing the March meeting, and that's when Garcia got up with a motion on that we don't stop at the gate, we drive the cars in. So the motion passed. So the next day, Thursday morning, we drive the cars in. Well, then we got in big trouble. Teamsters were threatening us with bad stuff, and the courts were trying to throw us in jail.
Wow.
And I remember one Teamster said to me, he said, I'm going to burn your house down. So I said to him, so can I get my fridge out? Because I just bought it. So that was that was interesting.
Yeah.
Goldblatt was up here as part of the international,
Yes.
and if I understand correctly, he was part of the first march inland.
Yeah, he was. He
Yeah.
In fact, you could basically say that he was responsible for the march inland.
Yeah, and it sounds like he was pushing something similar here.
Well, him and Bob Robertson, who was first vice president, that's an interesting one because down in the States, they when they organized, there's some things they didn't organize, like what we call grain liners or carpenters.
Uh-huh.
They're done by the pipe fitters or something because the union didn't organize those.
Yeah.
And then they had that system I explained where the Teamsters would come onto the dock.
Yeah.
They'd get on the lift truck, unload their truck. As long as they piled whatever it was one high, they could do that. If the dock wanted it too high, then they'd have to hire a longshoreman to put it too high. But one high, Teamster could do it. Then the truck, he would leave, and when the ship came in, they would hire a longshoreman to take that piece of wet cargo and take it to the hook. So Robertson came up and said, because that's what they wanted to do at Fraser Surrey as well. He said, don't make the mistake we made. So he was there, and I was there at the time the Teamsters came out. And they were trying the Teamsters to come out. And Bob Robertson was there on the dock. And they're talking to these Teamster guys. And he says to the Teamster guy, he said, you guys either get off the dock, or I'm going to tell these guys, and there was a whole horde of us, to throw you guys in the river. And they left. And that's how we got Fraser Strait up. And he said, don't make the mistake we did. Because there's a dock down in San Francisco, and they handle aluminum ingots. And wherever they make them, the trucks bring them down to the dock. And the driver gets out of the truck, gets on the lift truck, and puts the aluminum ingot, and it's an acre, I'd say, maybe 5 acre dock. That's just a little thing. And they cover that whole 5 acres with aluminum ingots, one high. And then when the ship comes in, the longshoremen go and get on the same lift trucks, take the ingots to the hook. No, if there's more ingots than that, they don't have to go too high. Then they hire a longshoreman to do it. But as long as they go one high, and that's what they do most of the time, that's how it's done. And they wanted to have that up here. And Bob Robertson said, and Goldblatt was involved in it, but it was Robertson that said, don't do what we did. That's a big mistake. But Goldblatt, he's got to get his due. He did the March inland was primarily as his, and statehood for Hawaii. He had a huge part in playing statehood in Hawaii, and he was the only guy during the internment that went in front of Congress and argued that interning the Japanese was unconstitutional, and paid a heavy price for that because that wasn't popular in those days, right?
So how much that's one example of where there was learning and exchange of ideas across the border. And did you do a lot of that? Did you go down and visit
all the time? Yeah, we would go down all the time. That's another story. Like one time, Davy Lomas and I, it was a barge conference. The area was international was holding a conference, and we were doing a lot of barge work in Westminster. In fact, it was the pipe to the Prudhoe Bay pipeline. It was all loaded onto barges and taken up there. So Dave Lomas and I went down there, and there was hardly anybody in the plane. I don't know, maybe 8 people. And so in the San Francisco airport, we had to go through these tunnels. So we're walking along these tunnels off the plane, going towards the customs. And I'm first, and Dave's behind me because you had to go single file. And I get to about where you are, and there's the custom guy. And he says to me, you're a union official, and so is that guy behind you. And I said, yeah. So then he said, what are you doing? So we told him. So there's nobody around. So he gets out this book, and he opens it up, and he looks up my name, and there's me, the date I joined the union, and all the offices I held.
Wow.
And he goes in Lomas, and there's a same thing about David. Then he gets this other book out, and he says, if you're in here, you don't get in.
Is that how you got on the Pinko list?
Yeah. No, I got on the Pinko list the other way, but that's how they keep track of you.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So then he was a nice guy. He was friendly, and then he said, carry on. So we went to the barge conference. So that's what it was like, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll tell you another funny story about Hawaii. Because the union made, like Hawaii, it's one big local, eh?
Right.
And the locals divided up into divisions, kind of a thing. Like the Hawaii pineapple workers are in one division, but it's all one local. And that was the concept they wanted to get everywhere, but we couldn't do it. So there's 140,000, or was, members in that one local.
Wow.
All made up of everything, from hotel workers to truck drivers to you name it. So one time at a convention, the president of the Hawaii local Canberra's name gets up and he says, "I want a roll call vote." So that means you vote your strength of your local, eh? So and this was an important issue that was being voted on. So the secretary called out 502, and I would get up and say, 3 members vote for. Then the guy say 20 members vote for, 10 more, whatever your local was, you voted. Hawaii guy gets up and says, "I vote 140,000 no." So the motion's lost. Well, now there's pandemonium up there.
Yeah.
So they went on to the next business. And after about an hour or two, he gets up and he says, "I want to put a motion on to reconsider." So he goes, "I want to reconsider that motion." So it passed. Yeah. So now he said, "I want another roll call vote." So it goes through the whole procedure. Now he gets up and said, 140,000 vote yes. So now it passes. So after it's settled, he gets up and he says, "I just wanted to show you guys where the power was."
Wow.
That's why he did it.
Yeah. That's great.
My goodness. And Jerry had mentioned that you did some work in California, or like using your travel card, were you able to also travel not only to Vancouver but to other
Yes, you could get
farther afield places?
Yeah, you can get a traveling card was good for the coast.
Okay.
And so you could travel down to wherever. When I was in high school, my dad did that, and we spent the whole summer in Los Angeles, worked as a travel card. And they have a really neat system down there. You work 2 and 2. Mm-hmm. And so my dad would go and work the first 2 hours, and then he'd come home and we'd go to Disneyland, and he would be on the payroll. And so that was good. But you can't, well, technically you can still do it, but immigration gets you right away.
Right.
And what I think happens is you go to work on the ship and the casuals find you work and they find you're a Canadian, they phone immigration.
Oh, I see.
Because
they want the work.
You're taking their job, right?
Right.
So you don't know that, but all of a sudden the immigration guy comes down the ship and says, "Andrea, back.
Yeah.
You're not now visiting, you're out. You're gone."
Mm-hmm. So we just, this won't go on the tape, but we had one guy say he worked in Wilmington. And I'm sure that means Southern California.
Yeah.
He doesn't mean Wilmington
No.
in South Carolina or whatever.
No, he'd be Wilmington that's the port in Los Angeles.
Right, okay.
Yeah, no, lots of people did that when it worked. Lots of people.
Would they do that just for a chance to live somewhere else and experience
just for the
life
fun of it.
and somewhere? Yeah.
Well, like I say, you go down and do your 2 hours, then you got your day off, right?
Right.
And that system survived when ILW Canada separated from the international?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, technically, I guess legally you can still do it. I mean, I can get a traveling card and go down to the port and show my traveling card, and they'll give me a job. Mm-hmm. That'll be the one and only job I get. Mm-hmm. And then I'll be back next day out of the United States, and probably never get back there again.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm. So it's technically possible, but practically not right. Not a good idea to do it. Mm-hmm. But you can do it between the locals. I mean, there's guys from the island come over and work in our port on traveling cards.
Oh yeah.
And when the island was really slack there for a while, we had, I'm going to say 10 or 12 guys worked out of our port steady. That's where they just worked here. They lived in hotels, went home on the weekend. Because it was so busy over here and slack over there, we just brought them over. And then they used to travel gangs. I never did this, but they used to travel gangs to the island. Whole gangs would go.
Wow.
And travel to Vancouver a lot. Because it's busy and we'd be slack. And then sometimes Vancouver gangs would come over to our place. Now it's we have wolfers every day. Like the Vancouver wolf sheet is sometimes 100 people.
Wow.
And because you got a guy that's a Vancouver member but lives in Surrey, why drive all the way into the hall when you can drive down to Tannery Road there and get a job?
So this is a guy who's got a regular position,
He's a member of 500.
and he's got a regular position
He-
somewhere in the Burrard Inlet or whatever.
He may not be a regular guy. He'll be on the board,
Okay.
on the working board. And rather than going into the hall and plugging in and getting whatever, he just goes down to our hall and plugs in. And we had guys that lived in Burnaby would do the same thing at 500.
Okay. And when you do that on the travel card, you maintain your hours at your local?
Yes, because the hours are maintained by the company, right?
Right.
Companies, the hours are a company thing. It's most of our benefits are hour based.
Yeah.
Like it's 500 hours for holidays, 800 hours for pension, 600 hours for your welfare benefits, dental and all of that. Basic medical is 600. If you want the full coverage, it's 1,200 or 100 hours a month. Your M&M is 3/4 of the average. So everything you get is hours based. So you have to hit a certain threshold.
Yeah.
But those hours can be worked anywhere in BC.
Okay.
No, except West Shore. West Shore 10 doesn't count because that's for the split is.
Yeah.
So that's one of the problems. The guys that do a lot of work at West Shore, they end up they're falling off the benefits. Most of them don't care because they're covered by West Shore benefits. But what they do care about is their holiday and their pension. So most of the guys will work 800 hours and then go to West Shore. Because once you get 800, you got your pension and your holiday pay. And that's the two big things. Because pension, they recognize broken service. But holiday, if you break a year, you lose all of it. So you could have 30 years in and you break a year, you start at number 1 again.
Oh my God.
So you want to maintain your 500 hours for sure. So that's why the guys that work the white list, we call them, those are the spares at West Shore. They got to maintain at least 800, and some of them get more because it's a kind of a complicated thing. But if you can get more than 800, you can get your full pension and your indexing and all that when you're retired.
Was it difficult to make it up to those levels of
Yes,
hours?
it is. Well, if it's slack, because remember, you're a wolfer, you're the last member out.
Right.
So, and if there's a whole bunch of wolfers ahead of you, you may be the last wolfer, so you may not get a job, right? So it's a gamble. But now, when it's busy, I guess it's not much of a gamble, but it is. It could be if it gets slack.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, how do the casuals at 502 feel about having 100 wolfers from 500?
They don't like it.
I bet they don't.
It's a bone of contention.
Yeah, I bet.
And there's nothing much you can do about it.
Yeah.
Because under the collective agreement, there's portability between the ports. And the members want the right to be able to go and do that. Because if it's slack, that's where you work. That's where you're going to get a job.
And the employer wants that as well.
The employer wants it too because he gets trades and skills.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of lots of times he hasn't got winch drivers. We do, so he'll take the winch drivers. He wants those. He needs them because if he doesn't have winch drivers, the gangs are down, ship's down. So it's a symbiotic relationship that does harm to the casuals. I mean, that's the honest truth of it. But what we say to them is, your day is coming. When you're a member, you can do the same thing. And that applies to a lot of things.
You say winchman.
Winch drivers, sorry.
Winch drivers.
Yeah.
Down south, they would call that a topman.
Topside. Yeah, we call it the same thing. We say topside too.
You do? Okay. Or you're just being an old-timer when you say winchman, winch driver.
Yeah. Yeah, when they do the dispatch, we have an order of dispatch. And I can't remember it anymore, but it's observers. Like there's some jobs that we don't do, like cranes, some mobile cranes, but they hire an observer because technically it's our work. So they hire a guy to watch. So those are first. And then they go, if I remember correctly, they go hatch tender, winch drivers, lift trucks, checkers, down the gantry drivers. Whichever is the priority is up to the top. Then the laborers or dockmen are at the bottom.
Right.
So the jobs you could not fill if you ran out of people are the jobs you put last. the key jobs like the crane drivers and the gantry drivers and those, because if you don't have those, then the job's down. So like sometimes if you don't have one guy, one person, because now we have women doing it, you could have 20, 30 people don't get a job. I have to go home without pay.
Right.
So that's kind of a key thing.
So with so many wolfers, does that have an effect on how long it takes to become a member? Like if you have less hours because there's more wolfers, does that affect how long it takes you?
I don't think so. No, I don't think the wolfing has. The work opportunity has raising the membership is always a huge debate. And in our local, it has been for the 48 years that I've been a member. It's always a huge argument. And there's those that don't want to raise it for obvious reasons, eh? And there's people that want to raise it for a whole variety of reasons. You got a son or a daughter down the board, you want to get them in, and it's busy and we need it, and so there's always that debate. It goes on all the time, and usually what we've been doing is we set a figure. Okay, we'll take the membership to $850, 10 a month for it till we get $850. Then we'll maintain it. So if a guy retires, we replace them. Somebody dies, we replace them. You transfer to 514, that's the Foreman's Local, we replace them. Then it goes on LTD, we replace them. So we maintain it at $850. And then that goes on for a while, and then the debate starts. Somebody puts a letter in, let's raise the membership. Then the argument goes back and forth, what do we do? And that usually takes 2 or 3 meetings, sometimes longer, to get a number. And then away we go again. But it goes up in ladders, right? What I think is harming the young guys is this non-mandatory retirement. Because what happens there is we have a group of people that are within the 850 that are 65 plus. So I think that is going to have an effect.
Right.
I'm aware of the time.
It's up to you guys.
So a couple.
I got nowhere to go and all day to get there.
Okay. All right.
Well, I was going to ask about the responsibilities of president. When we were speaking with Jerry, he said at the time that he was president, he had, for example, one person who had passed away on the job, and he said that he had to go and knock on the door and spoke with the son, and these kinds of heavy responsibilities kind of fall to the president. Could you talk a little bit about your experience
I had the
with
same
that?
thing. One of our guys, well, he wasn't killed, but he killed a person. He was a wolfer in Vancouver.
Oh, wow.
And what he was doing was loading bales of pulp onto a dolly, and he pushed the one on the other side off, and it landed on a person and killed him.
Oh, no.
So I had the business agent from 500 phone me up and said, your member was involved in an accident, and then the guy was killed. You better go and see him. So I had to go over to his house, and he was in bad shape.
Oh.
So you had to deal with, you had to deal with those kinds of things.
Right.
Goes with the territory. And then you deal with all kinds of disputes on the job. I remember one time I was one of these pipe shifts. I didn't get home all night because we were in an argument over manning, crane driving, and back and forth arbitration. It went on all night. So you get those kinds of things. It just goes with the job. And then you're responsible for the local. You have to chair all the meetings. And the meetings you're by virtue of your office automatically on the board, the area board, which is, you get meetings there. And then our local now, because we have these other contracts, well, you have 500 of them too, you're involved in negotiations with other contracts. And then you're on the negotiating committee of the main contract. And then you got a caucus meetings to go to, so there's lots to do.
Right.
And then you end up being sued. It's usually you that's sued.
Yeah.
You and the local. So you end up in court. And there's all that kind of stuff.
It's stressful work.
It can be, yes. Well, sometimes you got a problem and there's no solution to it.
Right.
So then you just gotta, and then you have all these contentious things like between the membership, you got big debates, and you have a way you want. The way you think it should go. Because I remember one time, it was it was during the AIB, this is another story at West Shore. We were negotiating a separate contract. And under the AI Beamer, they had the 6% and 4. So everything had to be
What does AIB stand for?
anti-inflation board, PEPENs, Trudeau's.
Okay.
So your contract had to be 6%. And that's when we caught on the idea that you look at everything. Everything is converted into money.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's a percentage of the, and it had to be 6% or less. And if it wasn't, the EIB could just take it away, say that's it, it's over the 6%, you're not getting it. But the trouble with the West Shore contract, and I always describe it as like a wheel. And in the center is the schedule, and all the things are spokes. Take one of the spokes away and the wheel collapses. So we had the same problem with the BCMA, we were bargaining at the same time. So we decided, I don't know who came up with this idea, I think it was Garcia, said let's get our actuary and boil the because we had our usual 300 demands, and boil it down to 5 or 6 that fit the AIB. So we did that, and we got it down to 5. And we walked in the employers and said, there. And we had them trapped. They agreed. So I said, this worked good. So then I went to West Shore, and I said, okay, to the committee, I said, we got to boil down our whatever down to the same thing. So we did, and that's we were trying to get the schedule, the 36-hour, that schedule I told you about.
Okay.
And we wanted an extra week. We only had 6 weeks holidays. So I said to Emil Bajarianson, who was our actuary, I said, we need these, we make it fit. So he did the schedule, an extra week, a wage increase, and he got everything down to 6%. So went into the West Shore and threw it on the table and said, there it is. So they went away and come back, but we had them, right?
Yeah.
So the guy, he was just a new president, just got hired. He come up and he says, you can have everything but the 1 week. He says, no, it's got to be all there. That fits the bill. He said, I can't give you the week. I said, give us the week or you're toast. The week is part of the thing. So he went away, I don't know where he was, going to come back. He said, okay, you got the week. So that's how we got it. He got fired the next week.
Wow.
And he was mad too because he said, I just paid $40,000 to have my boat bought up from Brazil. Now I got to ship it back.
Oh my.
But that's how we got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was that was rough. 'Cause
You're on your way out?
then you had
You're on your way out?
then you had to fill in these AIB2 forms for the government to say you comply.
Thank you.
So
See you later.
so we're in at the Kaiser office at the Board of Trade building, and Barry Robertson was and he comes in, and he's mad. Man, he's mad. It's what's the matter, Barry? You don't know what this guy did. I said, what did he do? Well, apparently I didn't realize this, but that's when Kaiser took 2% of everybody's 6% and gave it to himself.
Oh my gosh.
That's when he got the $50,000 raise and everybody else got 4%.
Oh no.
So we were in there to fill out these forms. And I said, well, Barry, you're working for the wrong people.
Oh my god.
I said, you should have gone,
Oh,
instead of going to
God.
university, you should have gone down to the university as Longshore House.
Oh my goodness.
Did you know many of the terminal managers well?
Yeah, the dock up, yeah.
The
very
dock
well,
operators?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And the BCME guys, you knew them.
tell us about some of the characters, some of the good guys and some of the bad guys.
Well, they're basically just doing their job, eh?
Uh-huh.
And there's some interesting guys. The guy at Fraser Surrey, a guy named Ken Cavanaugh, I had some real good ones around with him. And I remember him and I were always at it about one thing or another. And he decided to leave. They were going to, new owners bought it. He didn't fit the corporate image, is what he told me. So I didn't cut on at the time. That shows how stupid I am. But anyway, I was walking and he picked me up. He says, come here, I want to talk to you. So I get in the car and we're driving down the dock. And he says, I got to quit. He says, and I don't want to quit. He says, I like to work. So I said, well, Ken, I said, how much do you make? He said, $80,000. I said, well, I'll tell you what you do. I said, why don't we make up 8 or 10 $8,000 bursaries and we'll give them to kids to go to university. And you can keep working. You don't want the money. He slammed the car. Get out, he says. Get out of my car. And he left me way down on the end of the dock. I had to walk all the way back. But those are the kind of things.
Okay. Yeah.
But most of them are I mean, they were just doing their job, right?
Uh-huh.
You can't really fault them. They weren't on our side per se, but they weren't really our enemies that much either.
Yeah.
Most of them at the dock level weren't.
Yeah.
The BCMA probably a little different. The Strang and the Cunningham, those guys were more hard. They wanted, when Cunningham and Strang first came out from back east, I mean, one of the first things they did was ended up putting our presidents in jail.
Oh yeah.
And that set the tone for many, many years.
Right.
Because what it was over the stat holiday. Because when the stat holiday came in, they argued that Longshore was exempt from the act. So we didn't...
Because it was federal?
Yeah, because we wouldn't... so it was on May 24th, we wouldn't work. So then we got ordered back to work, and we ended up... Ultimately, we ended up in contempt of court. So the judge said to us and to the lawyers, $50,000 fine and 90 days in jail. So the decision was that the presidents would take the 90 days. So they did. They carted them all off to jail. And so, which was an odd thing, because I thought, our presidents went to jail and we all went to work. We just kept working, right? Mm-hmm. But anyway, that was the decision of the board, and so that's went along. And the funny thing about that was they ended up out there in that camp in Alouette Lake. So they decided, they said, we better not put these guys in with the general prison population because they're liable to organize the prisoners and cause a riot. So they ended up segregated them. And that long story short, I think it was the BC Fed raised the $50,000 and paid the fine.
Okay.
And they didn't do the 90 days. I think they did 30, 45 days of the 90 days.
Wow. Did that become like a story among the membership that the presidents had been sent to jail?
Yeah, it did. Again, it was a bit of a divisive thing because there was a group that wanted to go to war, right? They were putting our presidents in jail. But the decision from the board is that no, we keep working and we just make it. And I guess it was the wise one. We ended up being the victims, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things.
Okay.
But that came from the BCMA, not the dock operator per se. Mm-hmm. That was a decision of the BCMA board, right?
So you knew a lot of the dock operators and they were doing their job and then some of the BCMA guys that you negotiated with. I mean, you talked about some of them. Were there good BCMA guys?
Well, it's hard to say. Like the lower ranks again, you deal with them, right?
Yeah.
But they're in the middle between us and the guy up the top, right?
Yeah.
So the guy at the top says, "I want this guy punished," And you say no. So then this guy in the middle, he's got orders that he wants it, whatever it is, he wants something done about this guy, right? Mm-hmm. So he might agree to what you're suggesting, a lesser penalty or something else, but he's caught in the middle, right? So that I kind of felt sorry for them sometimes in that regard. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Cunningham, I didn't feel sorry. He was just a gangster, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And his nickname was Bicycle Chain Cunningham. And he used it for a reason. Because I remember when they opened the Vancouver Hall, I don't know who this guy was, but I was standing beside him and they were up there giving speeches. And he said, "See that guy up there?" He says, "Yeah." You see these teeth? He knocked them out, he says.
Wow.
So, because he was part of the SIU and the CME and Ewan's fiasco. When all that went on, there were big riots and fights when the two unions were fighting.
Okay.
Cunningham was a labor official for the Siemens International Union. So there's a lot of history there. But again, Norm was he was a funny kind of a guy. Yeah. Like they have what they share. They pay our dispatchers. They used to pay half because it's a joint dispatch technically. Mm-hmm. So we would be doing something that was bad. I don't know what it would be, and he would hold back. The check wouldn't come because it came in the mail, right? The secretary would say, "We haven't got our check." A couple of days late, right? So I'd go to the BCMA and I'd say to Norm Cunningham, I'd say, "We haven't got our check." He says, "I know." He says, "You guys aren't being very good." We'd done something, shut down a ship or whatever.
Yeah.
I'd say, "Norm," we'd have a bit of an argument. So after he said his piece, and then he'd throw the check at me. He says, "Get out." He says, "There's your money." So then I'd go, right? So those kind of things happened, right? So he was like that. That's what he was like.
Were there many like fights on the waterfront where guys would get into like physical
fights?
like fist fights and
Yes,
stuff?
there was a few. Yeah, a few. Usually it was, when I started, there was lots of 35 straight scabs, we call it, they were still there. And so that would sometimes start something.
Right.
Because you would do something and then the guy would say, "You're nothing but a blankety blank 35er. Well, then that would start the push and match. And sometimes it would get into. And then dispatch would be another time. Like some guy would do something that the other guy thought wasn't quite right. And because to go back to the dispatch, when they modernized, they tried different things. The pegs was the first thing. Then they tried an hour system. And they tried that with the casuals, and that was another disaster because it was based on honor. So when you worked on a job, you'd go in and sign, Joe Breaks. I worked 40 hours, 5 days. Well, we caught one guy, put 4 hours. So then the next week he's first out because he's only got 4 hours, right? So the way they caught him was there's guys worked with him. And they said, "Look, there's me. 40 hours, there's them 4. What's going on?" And we worked together all week on the same job. You got the dispatch at the room. So they asked him, "So I made a mistake. Sorry, I forgot to put the 0 down." Well, mind you, he's got a job. Eh?
Right.
So those kinds of things would start a fight, right? And knock down, drag, take him out in the parking lot, and they'd have it out. So that happened. Not a lot, but it did.
Were they just kind of left to settle it amongst themselves?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the way it was. You settled if you had a dispute with somebody, you settled it, and then it was over. That's it. It's done. Go back.
And then
to
they
work.
were able to back to work. And
go have a beer and carry on with life.
Did you find that was a good way of solving
it was
things?
better
really?
than now, because now we're charging each other with ununion contact in front of the grievance, and somebody's sworn at somebody. Well, man, in my day, that was normal. That's just the way it was.
Yeah.
Like, I remember one winter, the oldest Scott, he turned out to be one of my best friends. But anyway, I go down below. It's February, and I had one of those Mackinac jackets, pouring down rain, and it's before package lumber, and it's 3x9s, and they're all the same length. And this Cease Goodall, he says to me, "You young blank," he says, "I'm going to have that jacket off you before the end of the day." So I thought to myself, I didn't say anything because he's the boss, right? He says, "No, you're not." I thought to myself, "You're not." So then he grabs two pushes him at me. "Grab those, you young punk," he says. And so we're hitting the dumb end. So we grab, and away we go. And we're not walking, we're running, almost running, right? Back to the load, two more, all day. When I went home, I didn't even eat. I went to bed. I was bagged, but I didn't take my jacket off. The next day I come back, he says, "You're working with me. And now we're taking one." And that was the best friend. Absolutely the best ever. But that's what he was like, eh?
Yeah.
Well, he was a sergeant in the British Army. So the first time he saw somebody, he tried to break you down. And if he could, you're done. If he didn't crack you, then you're the best friend he ever had.
Wow.
And that's the way. And then lots of guys were like that. They would just try and break you, right?
Right.
And if they couldn't, then you were okay. You're in. If you've cracked you, then they rode you.
So he was a Scot?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so...
in fact, we interviewed him. He's one of the first interviews.
Right.
You got his interview.
And what was his name again?
Cease Goodall.
Oh, okay.
He's a redhead like you.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if I have that one yet on my...
It's Jerry and I first one.
Oh, okay. Must be on there somewhere.
Yeah, he's quite the character.
We
yeah.
should... We should...
I'll check and make sure that I've got that, yeah.
Yeah.
Might be on an SD card somewhere.
So this is a guy who grew up in Scotland and he was in the army. So tell us about some of the places around the world that people came from that you worked with.
Oh, there's all from. We had a lot of people from Hungary and places like that. Lots of them. Huge contingent of French Canadians from Millardville.
Oh yeah.
And they were some of the neatest guys to work with. But when you worked with them, they spoke French. If there was a gang of a whole bunch of them that they spoke French. I mean, they speak English to me because I can't speak French. But when they were talking to each other, it'd be French.
Yeah.
And those groups like that, There's all kind of people like that. And Dave Simpson, that's Scotty's brother-in-law, he was an interesting character. He was in the British Army as well. And he was in stores. And that guy could add up a column of figures in his head. Just go down with a pencil like that and write the answer at the bottom. Because he was a checker, and him and we're working together in Fraser, Surrey, and I was a dockman, he was a checker in the lift truck. And there was a gang of 3. We would load trucks. And they're rolls of we call them scalp, they're rolling metal, and they're all odd numbers, like 5,822 pounds. None of them they're all, and so as the driver would pick up a load, he'd drive by and Dave would write the number down on a big long sheet, and he'd put about 40 of these on a truck. So Dave would sit there and just go down and he'd write the bottom.
Wow.
And the truck driver's on there with a calculator. He gets off the truck, he says to Dave, I got 40,300. Dave says, no, you're not. You got 40,900 or something. The guy said, no. Dave says, no, this is what you got. So they get on the truck together. Guess who was right?
Oh, wow.
I'd seen him do that lots.
Yeah.
Oh, he was amazing.
Wow.
But he worked in the stores, and that's what he did. That's the kind of work he did. And he ended up as our secretary treasurer, and he'd do the same thing with the books of the union. And his books were perfect.
Yeah.
When the auditor did his, he just done.
Beauty.
Yeah, he was something else again. And we had they used to say, I don't know if it was true, that we could design, build a high rise. We had architects, engineers, we had everything, all kinds of people.
Yeah.
Well, I used to say as a joke, we got everything from murderers to missionaries on the waterfront.
And when did women first start coming in?
Let me think now. That would be in 2000, somewhere around there, late.
Okay.
I swore the first woman in. She would have taken about 8 or 9 years to get there. We're up to about 10, 11 years now. The last year, about almost half of what we've taken has been females, which is a good thing. Right. It's good. They're really good operators, really good. They brought a calming influence to the waterfront.
To calm down all the testosterone and that kind of
little. I guess.
Is that what you mean?
I guess it is. I don't know what it is, but they're good. They're really good.
Right. Mm-hmm. The first woman who you swore in.
I can't even think of her name now. That's what a disgrace. Yeah, she.
Was she the daughter of a longshoreman? Like, is that how she?
I don't think so. No.
No.
She might have been a friend or a relative.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, she worked her way up. She worked at West Shore for a while. I don't think she liked that, but because she only stayed for a while and then quit. I don't know what she's doing now. Most of them are driving equipment. Some of them are in the checking area. Some of them are just working.
Yeah.
The only job not the only, that would be a bit difficult for women is the lashing bars, the long ones, the 40-footers. They're heavy. They're about that big around, and they hook the edge of the containers. They lash them to the deck.
So that's 40 foot. So it's pulling down about 5 containers.
Yeah. They go in the top ones, and then they have a turnbuckle, and you just kind of unhook it. So that could be a bit difficult, but other than that, there's nothing that a woman couldn't do. So, and now there's so much machine operating that they once they get on the B board, maybe even lower, they take training on equipment, and they don't do that anymore. They're equipment operators.
Was there any resistance to the first woman that you had sworn in, or the idea of inducting women members?
No, there wasn't. It actually went when I first started. I would years ago. There was a couple of women came down, and they said, and I said, come back at 4:00. They would, and they didn't come. Had they done, they would have got a car shift job, which is ideal. But they didn't show up. I kind of think it was some of our aces at the beer parlor talked to me just to play a bit of a joke, right? I don't think they were serious. But we would have had women earlier had they done it. And then it wasn't until like around 2000, somewhere in there, that they come down. And I don't think there was any resistance. We had one foreman that we got kicked off because of some stuff. But basically, I would say they were accepted pretty well.
Yeah. And if you swore her in 2000, then she started sometime in the 90s. Yeah. Early 90s.
Yeah, she probably did. Well, because we were getting down. She probably took 6 years, because that's the low point. We got down to about 6 years, and now it's crept back up.
Yeah.
Because once the TSA was built, we had to build our local up really fast. So we started taking members in big time. And it went from about, say, 10, 11 years down to about 6. And then when we got up, we went to back up again.
So you just called it TSA. So
TSI, sorry. Did I say TSA?
TSI, okay.
TSI,
All right.
yeah.
So just in case we use this as a clip, maybe just when you say just say what you mean by TSI.
It's was it Trans World Services? It's the container dock down at Tsawwassen there.
Right.
Okay.
So sometimes called Roberts Bank.
Well, Roberts Banks is the area.
Yeah.
And at Roberts Banks, there's West Shore Terminals, which is on the end, and then there's TSI, which is the container dock next door.
Right.
And then someday, I guess, there'll be another container dock on the other side.
Terminal 2.
Yeah. So I don't know who will operate that. Who will be the husband of that operation? But I imagine TSI would like to be. But who knows? So.
Can we jump back in history
Yeah.
to 502 and 511? What were the differences? How did that work break down between them? Who did what? And
okay.
and then after that, talk a little bit about how and why they amalgamated when they did.
Okay, 511 was the dock work, and that they worked at PCT where the Westminster Quay is now.
Okay.
And they did what we call dock work now. They drove lift trucks, jitneys. They unloaded rail cars, unloaded trucks, loaded rail cars, loaded trucks with whatever. And they cleaned the dock, and they did the maintenance work, mechanic, carpenters, electricians, whatever. 502 was the deep sea. We did the ship work. And the difference was 50 cents an hour. We got 50 cents an hour more. And we had basically one rate there were skill differentials. Side runners got 20 cents an hour more. Winch drivers got 20 cents an hour more. Hatch tenders got 30 cents an hour more. Everybody else got the base rate. On the dock, there was 3 different rates. If you were feeding the hook, in other words, bringing cargo, say, from the dock to the ship, you got the longshore rate. Or if you were taking cargo from the ship out to the truck, you got the longshore rate. If you were working on the dock, just loading the rail cars, unloading the rail cars, cleaning the dock, doing any of that, unloading trucks, you got 50 cents an hour less. And maintenance, the mechanics got something, I can't remember what they got less again. So the decision by, it's from Harry Bridges. Again, they're trying to build this one local concept. Was that we amalgamate. And Craig Bruchette was his representative. He had an appointed guy. Craig Bruchette was him. And they had a huge discussion amongst the union, all the locals, to do that. Again, a decision that wasn't unanimous, to say the least. So anyway, eventually everybody agreed. So it would be about 62, 63 when it happened. And in our case, it was just 2 locals. And the agreement was that they would get 3 spots on their executive. They had 3 years with which to get out either side. And then the amalgamation took place. In 500, it was more complicated because each trade had its own local. First aid was an own local. They had 2 checkers locals. They had 2 dock locals. There was a deep sea local. There was a coastwise local. There was a grain liners local. And they were all separate. All had their own presidents, everything. And some of them their own rates. So that's when they decided to make, because 501 was the deep sea local, and then they went up from there. 505 was the checkers, 506 was the checkers, 505 was the first aid, 512 was the dock. Can't remember all the numbers now, but anyway, 510 was something. 510 was first aid, I guess. But anyway, so they couldn't agree on a number, so that's where they settled on 500. So they all became 500. And they agreed their seniority, they went by the pensionable years, because seniority is a big issue, right? Which was never solved in our local. So they agreed that they would use the pension year. If you needed 800 hours, you had a seniority year. So that's how they did it. So everybody with 800 hours, if you had 20 years, I had 10. Even though I was on the waterfront, 80, it doesn't matter. That's where we went. We fitted, which I guess caused a big riot, but that's what happened. In our local, we weren't successful because our local is your seniority starts the night you're sworn in. And that's because of the 35 strike. On the dock, you were sworn in 90 days after you started, and your seniority went back to your start date.
Mm-hmm.
So guess what happened? Eh? When they put the two locals together, we had guys that started 3 years after me, ended up with more seniority than me. Because they were in the union ahead of me.
Uh-oh.
So that, and I'm not the only guy.
Yeah.
I'm talking dozens.
Mm-hmm.
Dozens. And some guys, really senior guys. Because there was guys on the dock that were 35 scabs on the dock, ended up with more seniority than guys who didn't scab, but were longshore. Now, fortunately, those guys stayed on the dock, so it wasn't a problem. If they'd have quit and gone back to the hall and then said, okay, I'm bumping you off the winch, there would have been a riot. But that didn't happen. But that's the difference. Mm-hmm. So then the amalgamation went along for, 3 years till I got there in 66. And that's when the end of the 3-year period was. And there was still lots of animosity. Mm-hmm. And the animosity went on until basically PCT started to shut down. And a lot of those guys quit and ended up going, a bunch of them went to West Shore, which was a good thing in a way because we couldn't get people to go to West Shore because when I told you there was that, you'd be deregistered. Right. But some of them went anyway. And so they filled a whole bunch of spots at West Shore, which took some of the pressure off. And then it got busy, so they all kind of fit in.
Were there more 35 on the dock side? Or were there
no, not really.
Did the difference between 502 and 511, did that reflect a difference from 35? Or
no. It was just different organization, different wage rates, and different conditions. Like we didn't have a pension on the longshore side until 58, but they had a superannuation system on the docks from I don't know when, early on.
Were they maybe the company union that was set up after?
Well, it wasn't particularly a company union, but it was located to that dock, so it was that dock's local union. Yeah. So they weren't I'm not going to say they're sympathetic, but there wasn't a lot of friction, eh? And I can only think of on the dock, and there might have been more, but I can think of two scabs who were there when I started. Yeah. And they were the senior guys. They'd been around. Yeah. Everybody else had started it.
I guess another way of asking what I'm trying to ask is, did the 502 guys did the 511 guys tend to come from New West, and the 502 guys came from all over the place? Pretty
well, yeah. In fact, there's a guy, that's reminding me of a story. There was a guy that worked at PCT. He was a dockman. He was unskilled, worked as a laborer. Neatest guy. He'd never been off Columbia Street in 25 years. Wow. He lived at the Windsor Hotel, walked down the 2 blocks where it was to work, and then back again. And that's all he did. And I worked with him lots of times at laboring, we were together working as laborers. Eh? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that was, the people that worked at PCT, by and large, were New Westminster residents. Not totally, but by and large.
Sure. Yeah. And 502 tended to be broader.
Pretty well, it'd be all. There'd be a lot of Westminster guys. There was a lot of guys that lived in it, because that was another issue we had. Like, we wanted to move our hall. Well, the guys that lived in Westminster didn't want to move it, right? So we'd have a huge debate about that.
When did you move the hall?
Well, we didn't move it until, Brian was president. But we wanted to get out of there years and years earlier, because the work, I would say in the middle 70s, because West Shore started up in 70, and most of the work had moved to Surrey side. So we had guys, having to drive into Westminster in the rush hour traffic, get a job, drive all the way back to Surrey, or drive out to West Shore, and then the car dock started down in Richmond. Mm-hmm. So you had to do a lot of driving. So we thought, well, if we could get a hall down in Delta or something, but we could never get an agreement. Mm-hmm. Never. And there was that bit of a split, eh? Mm-hmm. Surrey guys, Westminster guys. Not a serious one, but there was that.
Sure.
There was an argument.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask a little bit about, we were talking to Jerry, and he had said that you guys used to have you do still have a picnic every summer, and
yes.
You'd have the families in, and
yeah, we still do.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about that when you started?
Well, the picnics were for years, and we had. In fact, when I was a kid, we used to have them at Bowen Island.
Oh,
I remember going with our family when I was a young kid. I'd be 7, 8, 9 maybe. Mm-hmm. And then the locals started to have their own, and we'd have ours at Cultus Lake.
Mm-hmm.
And then we ended up, that was a car fight, and so we needed to shut the dock down. So, legally.
Mm-hmm.
So, we said we're going to have and we couldn't have a picnic because we'd agreed took that out of the contract. The day, we used to be a stop work day.
Mm-hmm.
It was gone, we couldn't do it. So I thought, well, the pensioners will have it.
Mm-hmm.
And invite everybody. And everybody, if you're working, you won't refuse to go, you'll just book off.
Right.
You won't say why, you just book it off. So that's what we did. So it's become that ever since. So now, the pensioners have the picnic.
Ah.
We're not legally allowed to have a picnic. There's no day off anymore, like it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
The pensioners have a picnic, and everybody that wants to go books off.
Okay.
And you go. And some days the port's in pretty bad shape.
Yeah. And that was your idea to do
Yeah.
it that way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I needed to shut the dock down. That was the reason. It wasn't to have a picnic.
Yeah. I see. And so did you go, like, with your dad when you were a kid? Did you
Yes.
go to the picnic?
Yeah, we used to go to Bowen Island.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'd go to Cultus Lake.
Mhm.
I mean, it's a good deal for the kids. There's enough
Yeah.
ice cream to float the battleship, and everything's free.
Mm-hmm.
Pop, ice cream, whatever there is, it's all free. And the kids ride on the rides and do whatever, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't gone for quite a while because I haven't got any kids, but
And Fiona said the rides were free and all of that.
yeah,
I
everything's
think,
fine.
too.
Yeah, they used to rent the slides and the rides, and I forget what we paid. It cost a fair buck,
Mhm.
like
Oh, yeah.
20, 30 grand or something like that. But it's a good deal.
Was it seen to be like an important expenditure? Or
Oh
something
yeah,
that you need
nobody,
to do?
no
Was
problem.
For morale and that
Yeah,
kind of thing?
when the secretary gets up and says we need to, well, we used to assess ourselves. We need to assess whatever, $20 for the picnic is going to cost. There was never an argument.
Mm-hmm.
It just passed. It was almost unanimous.
Right. And it was much smaller in those days, so did all the families kind of know each other?
Pretty
that would
well,
go
yeah.
every
Lots
year?
of families did. And yeah, there wasn't any. If you were in a gang, like the gang, my dad's gang was Lavery's gang.
Mm-hmm.
So all the guys in Lavery's gangs, we would kind of congregate together, right?
Mhm.
The husbands all worked together. The wives
Mhm.
all knew each other. So yeah, that's how it worked, eh?
Mhm.
And, I mean, I can tell you a funny story about that. The Lavery's, Maurice LaRue was my dad's partner. They were really close friends, eh? And one day, one of our guys, I was president, and one of our guys had liberated some wine, and the police caught him at the gate. And they arrested him and then let him go. So the next morning, I found out, I went up to the police station, and I said, what about, and they said, no record of it. And I said, what do you mean no record of it? There's no record of it. So anyway, I thought, well, that's fine. And then I get a phone call from Maurice LaRue's wife. She says, the police were here about the stuff. I said, yeah, what did they say? They didn't say anything. All they wanted to know was about you. What we knew about you. And that was it.
Wow.
And then never heard a word.
About you?
Yeah, because I was president, right?
Oh.
When was that?
That would have been in about 73. That's why I had him on the Pinko list.
So you think they're trying to like dig up information on
Yeah.
you or what? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Well, they did to everybody, not just me.
Yeah.
Everybody. Because
The high-ranking guys and that kind
yeah,
of thing.
everybody.
They
Because
wanted to find out about
when
you.
we were at area, I was bargaining, and we were at we had a board meeting late at night, and the next morning we come back, and the area board had been broken in, the area office is broken into. And Mila was the secretary, and she knew where everything was. She says the files have been gone through. She says they were really clumsy.
Yeah.
And she kept, well, I remember it was $15 in a box, like a float. It was on her desk. And a camera there that we used to use for a Polaroid for taking safety pictures. Mm-hmm. They didn't take, I mean, if they were smart, they would have taken those things to make it look like a burglary.
Yeah.
But they'd knocked in the door, went through the files, never took a thing.
Huh.
Yeah, they know everything. You'd be surprised that they know.
Yeah, yeah.
Like when we had that picket, and our local had to picket the bus stop barn, and then we did the graveyard. And so there was a whole bunch of us, union officials, all kinds of guys out there. Must have been 50 of us picketing the bus barns in Burnaby there on Sprott Street.
Okay.
It was midnight. I mean, late in the morning, and this car drives up, And these two guys get out in suits. And they walk beside me. I'm as close as I am to Andrea. And my business agent was where you were. And they said, that guy's the president. That guy's the BA. That guy belongs to this union. They picked out every one of us in the dark.
Wow.
How did they know all that?
So how long did you stay? How long were you president through into the 80s? Or were you involved?
79 was my last year.
79 was your last year.
Yeah.
So 72 to 79 was
Yes.
the space where you were the president?
Yeah, I had 1 year off.
And you retired when?
I retired in 06 from work.
From work?
Yeah.
In 06.
I spent the last 19 years at West Shore.
And was there any particular reason why you weren't an official during that time? Did you?
No, I decided. Well, I did the bargaining at West Shore. I've done it since contract 1.
Okay.
And they always conned me into doing it. But so I did that.
Uh-huh.
But I wasn't an official, like a business agent or on the executive or any of those kinds of things. In fact, I think it was Jerry that took over from me in the 80s.
How did you? What did you think about the container clause as a member when it came to that?
Well, at the time, I
Yeah.
thought this isn't a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Because we did a lot of work, a lot of man hours, stripping and stuffing containers, and they were really good jobs. I mean, we had some pretty cushy operations going on there.
Mm-hmm.
So when we thought this is going to be gone, I mean, but like I say, as it turned out, in hindsight, it wasn't altogether a bad thing. Because the man hours have gone up, and they've taken different forms, right? And now we've got that money in the pension, so it's just a big thing.
Yeah.
So when you're faced with the issue and you don't know the future, you don't know where you're at, and you don't know whether
Right.
you're a foot or horseback. But then, as you get into it and things develop, so it's turned out not to be too bad. It's kind of like the Luddites and the machines, They smashed them, and it turned out they're not a bad thing.
Did you back? I'm jumping in times, but in '63, when you were looking at the amalgamation of 502 and 511, and then in '69 when they brought in the container clause. When those things were, when those things were happening, how much did people talk about technology at the time?
Technology, probably not at all, because we didn't view it as technology, right? We just viewed it as a modernization of the industry. And that reason, because we have this thing called the M&M, which is modernization and mechanization. You've probably heard of that.
Sure.
It's a lump of money, sum of money you get. And the idea of it was, it came in 58, 59 in the States, here in 62. And it was Harry Bridges' idea that because he was a pretty forward-thinking guy, and he could see containerization and modernization and railroads and all that kind of stuff coming on. So he thought that people were going to be displaced. So the logical thing would be to displace the senior guys, but give them what we call a buyout today, and their pension. So we come up with this modernization and mechanization fund, and that would be it was approximately a year's salary. I think it was $7,200, which was about what we earned a year. And for that, you would then retire. You would get your pension. You get that chunk of dough, and away you'd go off to your dotage, and some young guy would get the job, right? So that came here and us. So that's how we viewed it, basically, not as mechanization. Which is what we think is technology today would be foreign thinking to us. We just thought it as a modernization of the industry. And it happened slowly, because the first thing was the electrics come on. They went ships, so that reduced the winch driver. And then packaged lumber came on, and we broke the bands first. We used the Assassinator, and then they brought the lift trucks. So that reduced the gang size.
So each time they reduced the gang size, the oldest guy would get an M&M.
Well, but the thing about it was we never got to use the M&M because we never reduced it. We never lost manning. the industry expand to fill the spots. So there's no point where we can say, Andrea lost her job because the machine came. Because Andrea went and got a different job.
Because the machines.
Because the machine came. She drove the machine. Or she did something else, right? Or she went to the dock and checked. Or whatever. She wasn't down below carrying lumber anymore. She was doing something else. And that's, the whole industry went that way. So that's how it's gone. The M&M is still there. Although now the wording of it has changed and the reason for it is gone. Now it's just, I call it a $70,000 gold watch. You just get this chunk of dough and you go. Now, if for any reason the industry was to contract and we had to get people out of here, then we might resurrect that business. We have a similar kind of an agreement at West Shore. If a layoff comes, they lay off, they offer the senior person a buyout and all kinds of goodies to entice them to go. So that would probably be how we'd approach that. But fortunately, we haven't had that problem. The industry has expanded to fill the jobs.
Whereas they have used the M&M and
Yeah, they have. Yeah, they have used it. Yes.
yeah.
We haven't had to so far.
Do you,
Well, sorry. Go ahead.
well, have you not have you not used it because it exists? That's another way of saying has the employer found a way to keep people working because they didn't want to pay?
I would doubt that would be a logic they would use. Not only because the work industry's expanded. I mean, I don't think they sat down and said, okay, we're going to have to pay M&M here. We better make sure there's lots of jobs around. I don't think that was their argument, the way they thought. The industry just expanded, and so they haven't had, neither side has had to use it, fortunately. I mean, it's there, and maybe someday we will. I mean, if you follow the ups and downs of history, probably someday we might have to. Say to the older guys, you go. But what might trigger is this non-retirement thing. I mean, we're going to end up with people in their 90s dumb enough to still be working. Only because they can.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you would do if the work was to contract and then you had to lay, and then these guys are going to say, well, by rights I can work. Under the human rights I can work. You get rid of Andrea, she's just started. Which to me is criminal. But that may end up like that. Right?
What do you if in all the time that you've been working, what has been the lowest point of cargo handling that you can think of?
The lowest point in my mind
Of hours for 502.
Yeah, well, there was during the 80s, various times in the 80s, early 80s, and then later on. The 82, 3, somewhere in there, there was virtually nothing. I was working in Fraser, Surrey, as a railroad switchman, and so they kept us. But they did some layoffs, and there was no work. There was just, in Fraser, Surrey, they had a lot of steel, plate, bi-beams, all that kind of stuff. And there was about four big importers of steel, and they would import a whole shipload, just bring it in. And then they would sell it off the dock, and we would load the trucks. They would send a truck down and say, pick up 4 plates. He'd come down with us bill and say, we'd go get the 4 plates for them. Well, some of those importers got down to 4 plates, and then fortunately it picked up. And then there was a time later on where it got slack, and there was A-board guys didn't get their 800 hours. I think one got it, so which means their holiday's gone, right? So some of those guys had 8-10 years in, lost their 800 hours, come back and started day one again.
Oh no.
So Garcia was fortunate enough. He went to Strang. I don't know what he did. He got them to. They just lost the 1 year, so they got back what they had. So those are the 2 really low points.
But even in those 2 low, into those 2 low points, some guys were laid off. You said, but it never triggered M&M.
No. What happened with most of them, that's when they went wolfing in Vancouver. just to pay their bills, right?
Uh-huh.
And there was a little bit of work around, but there was nothing for casuals. Casuals. That's the other thing about our industry. We've got a buffer. If the work drops down, the first guys to suffer are the bottom casuals,
Right.
and then it works up. The disease eats its way up the boards. If it's really bad, then the A board, none of them work. What work is available is shared by the members, and then we've always got the traveling, to Wolfing and Vancouver. So between those two things, even at the lowest point that I've ever seen, the members have been able to survive. Some of the casuals have had to leave, and probably did leave. I don't know. Can't think of any, but I would imagine some had.
Sure. And would a low period trigger M&M, or do you need a specific?
They would. You would need a specific. Yeah, because if a casual, it was like we had a guarantee, but if one casual worked 1 hour, the guarantee was null and void, because the member could have had that job.
You don't have that guarantee anymore.
No, we don't have it. It's gone.
Yeah.
And the M&M would be a similar kind of thing. I think if you put a casual out, like during the year, and you were saying, okay, look at this year, but there's all these members couldn't work, and they found one casual worked an hour, they'd say, it's gone.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And our industry is such that a casual could walk in the hall and somebody get hurt, and there's nobody else there.
Right.
And they'd say, you want to go to work? You say, yeah, naturally. And that would trigger all kinds of bad things.
Uh-oh.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground.